came with sandals, no socks. There was an audible gasp. So clothing became our anti-colonial protest. And I think the People's Action Party then decided to wear white shirt and white pants, you know. So clothing became the anti-colonial protest. Then there was the episode of ink. It was about the order of things. When Marshall first met Nicol with his cabinet, that was the colonial secretary, the attorney general, the financial secretary. He said he was waiting for the first statement to be of great import, to be profound. And Sir John Nicol said, "Marshall, I use red ink." And Marshall said, "I beg your pardon?" And Sir William Good, Chief Secretary, leaned over and said to Marshall, "The governor uses red ink. When he signs it red ink, it means that is the final word." And Marshall said, "What's this?" Then the Attorney General leaned over to him and said, "Marshall, and I use green ink." So Marshall was really furious. So he said, "Thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for reminding me of that delightful color in ink. Henceforth, I shall use green ink, and no one else should use green ink." Now, those of you who've received anything from David Marshall will know he always uses green ink to sign his name. So these were some of the early fights. It's style, it's not substance, but it was a statement of colonial authority, and that was what he had to do. Then there was a problem. He didn't have an office. They gave him a small little office, he was Minister of Commerce at the same time. So they gave him a Minister of Commerce office. He didn't have an office as Chief Minister. He refused to take up that office, and he said he would sit out under the old apple tree and use that as his Chief Minister's office until he had a proper office. So in the end, they tufted out George Thompson and gave David Marshall George Thompson's office. Now, David Marshall, in fact, didn't get on with Nicol at all, Sir John Nicol. Nicol found him confrontational, challenging protocol and the Constitution at every turn. Marshall relished confrontation, the publicity, and saw each occasion as an opportunity to educate the masses. I would say he was the early politician of the sound bite. But sound bites don't add up sometimes to a good policy. On substantive issues, and there were substantive issues that defined Marshall, and I will tell you what they are. Now you have to remember, David Marshall was elected on April 2nd. On April 6th, he met with the governor and the Council of Ministers where he had this exchange. But Singapore was facing a revolutionary ferment at that time. The United Front and the Malaysian Communist Party, they were working, the mass organizations, trade unions, and any union they could get hold of. In this mix entered the Chinese middle school students, thousands of them. And I looked at those figures, trade unions of 9,000 people, 10,000 people. You could get thousands on the streets. I mean, today's Singapore could not conceive of that. And into this mix were thousands of Chinese middle school students. They were drawn into the play and they supported the trade unionists. And the Hockley bus riot, the Hockley bus dispute was brewing in April too. So imagine, you step into the scene, there were strikes, all threatened, disputes. The middle school students were already politicized. This was what Marshall walked into. I think there were three defining tests for him from the word go. Firstly, how would Marshall handle the renewing of emergency regulations? The Labour Front, in fact, campaigned on the fact that they would abolish emergency regulations at the election campaign. And, Marshall said, you can't sort of say that, and Lim Yew Hock said, don't worry, David, we'll never get elected. But there they were elected. Now, in view of the strikes and violence, he was asked by the colonial authorities to renew the emergency regulations. It's your Internal Security Act today. This would be the test and defining moment of what sort of leader David Marshall would be. In the end, Marshall revoked some of the powers, like grabbing hold of the property, the way you would arrest people, and then he extended key ones. He extended detention without trial, restrictions on free speech. He did what he had to do. The colonial authorities were on him to do that. And the Malaya made representation. The government of Malaya wanted that because they felt their security in Malaya was threatened if Singapore allowed things to get out of hand. So on the security issue, this was a key question. Then there was a Hockley bus riot brewing in earnest from April 23rd to 26th. If you remember, those of you who can remember, May 13th was Black Thursday. The riot just burst out. Violence broke out. An American journalist was killed. 2 policemen died. A student was killed. Many were injured. Buses were burnt. And students were rampaging the strikers too, chanting and rioting. I don't think you can imagine that sort of scene now, but it did happen. There was a bus strike where the middle school students came in demonstrating and supporting the workers. The issue was, can Marshall handle the situation? And this was a question that dogged him through the first few months. He was roundly criticized by the local media as weak. The governor and chief secretary called Marshall in to tell him to call the troops. But Marshall refused the action during the general build-up of the strike. He didn't want to bring in the troops then. Marshall justified to me that he did not have enough information. How can he call in the troops? He didn't know what was happening. Francis Thomas also said he did not have enough information. Sir William Good, when I met him in Britain, said to me that considering he was trying to convince Marshall of the necessity of retaining and using the power to detain without trial, I probably put more details to him than I did later to Lim Yew Hock, said William Good. Now, the Singaporeans asserted that the British kept them in the dark on security matters. The British said we gave enough information. I think this episode highlights a perennial and enduring problem in a democracy and maintaining democratic norms versus the use of force and power to suppress in security matters. How much information do you need before you act? I think this question is faced even today. There's a big debate in the United States. It is in the end a judgment call. And Marshall said, and I quote him because this gives you an idea of his thinking. Had we, prior to the 13th, sought to use the bullet and the emergency regulations as a means for establishing order, we would have destroyed the concept of democracy and its value in a territory, we would have destroyed the concept of democracy and its value in this territory completely. We would have identified ourselves with a system which we ourselves abhor. It was important that we should act in a fashion which would destroy not ourselves, which does not matter, but which would destroy those ideals for which I trust the great majority of the members of this House are striving for, the ideals of a democratic process. We would have given magnificent propaganda value to those who say that this Constitution is unworkable and that it is not democratic in utilizing, when it seemed unnecessary from service systems, methods which were too drastic. So he was torn by the desire to maintain the democratic ideals. Now, Vernon Bartlett was a very well-known columnist at that time, British, and he wrote an op-ed in the